Calgary Midnapore.
You know, it's certainly an honor to serve with the member for Carleton, and always very difficult to have to follow his speeches, but that's what I'm going to have to do here today, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the bottom line, the main reason that we have brought forward this opposition or this concurrence motion here today is for one reason, and for one reason alone. And that is, Madam Speaker, we don't trust this government to audit themselves. You're here. So I say to you, Madam Speaker, call in the auditors. That's what I say, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, why should we have any faith in this government to audit themselves after the horrific things that we have seen in the time that this Prime Minister and this government have been in office? We've seen things such as SNC-Lavalin, terrible scandal. We've seen things such as the We charity, just millions and millions of dollars being spent without any idea as to where they're going. Madam Speaker, as a woman, I find it especially offensive, all of the women that have been thrown under the bus. The former Justice Minister, for example, the former Health Minister, for example. We've seen, of course, Selena Cesar Chavez, who has now come out and said that she was not treated well by this government or by this Prime Minister. And sadly, most recently, the former Minister of Sport, who actually had to take a leave of absence in an effort to have to deal with this government. Madam Speaker, we don't trust this government to be ethical or to audit themselves. So I say to you, Madam Speaker, call in the auditors. All right, Madam Speaker, they won't admit to how much money they have spent. Madam Speaker, on January 4th, 2003, CBC published an article showing the Liberal government has spent over 30 times more in contracts with McKinsey and Company than under the previous government. But on January 17th, 2023, the Globe and Mail published an article stating the actual value of the government contracts with McKinsey since 2015 actually amounted to $101.4 million, much higher than previously reported. But, Madam Speaker, it didn't stop there. On January 31st, the Globe and Mail published another article based off of documents in a court case in Puerto Rico. Federal contracts awarded to McKinsey are now estimated to be at least $16.8 million, Madam Speaker. And we've asked the Prime Minister, Madam Speaker, several times in this House to tell us the amount that he has spent on McKinsey and Company. They won't even admit to how much they spent. So, Madam Speaker, call in the auditors. Madam Speaker, major policy decisions are being made by McKinsey and Company and not public servants. We've seen the influence of McKinsey and Company throughout this government, specifically, for example, with immigration. We've seen that Dominic Barton's influence on the immigration project, along with his new Century initiative. Really, this is influencing immigration policy within our country, in addition to other policy. We've seen, I actually just came from government operations, Madam Speaker, where we found out there where the current CEO of the Infrastructure Bank admitted to one of our fantastic members here, the Member of Parliament for Haldimand Norfolk, that the Canadian Infrastructure Bank was actually a product of Dominic Barton and McKinsey. He actually admitted to that. And it's not surprising, because if you look at the order paper questions, which we received, the outline of their goal there, McKinsey's goal there, was consulting advice and recommendations on decision criteria to screen and evaluate potential investments, including objectives, terms, and principles, and benchmarking review of these criteria with other infrastructure banks around the world based on their mandate. And it doesn't stop there, Madam Speaker. Other projects included McKinsey was hired for by the Infrastructure Bank, consulting advice and recommendations on strategy-related matters to advance the CIB's mandate and increase in public impact. Sounds like they were hired to try and convince the public it was a good thing, Madam Speaker. Facilitating expert advisor workshops and recommendations to advance the CIB's mandate and increase the public mandate. So, Madam Speaker, once again, we can't trust this government, because their major policy decisions are being made by McKinsey and not by public servants. Madam Speaker, call in the auditors. Madam Speaker, there is a consistent lack of transparency and accountability that we have seen by this government. Madam Speaker, when we had Mr. Barton at Government Operations Committee last week, he tried to create the illusion of no relationship, no friendship between himself and the Prime Minister, but good friends embrace when they greet each other. Good friends have friends over for dinner, as we saw Dominic Barton do with the current finance minister. He was over at her house for dinner with other influential people. So, Madam Speaker, in addition to all of the other things I previously mentioned, there is a clear lack of transparency and accountability with this government and their relationship with McKinsey & Company. And we've also seen it from the former finance minister, Bill Morneau, who actually makes reference to it in his book. We've seen the glowing welcome that the Prime Minister gave Dominic Barton at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, and 2016. Madam Speaker, there is a clear lack of transparency and accountability and proximity of the relationship between this government, the Prime Minister, and McKinsey & Company. So, Madam Speaker, do you know what we need to do? We need to call in the auditors. That's right. That's right. Madam Speaker, a government should not be doing business with a company with such low ethical standards. And, Madam Speaker, I wouldn't even know where to begin there. I could start with the campaign financing in France that we've seen. We could talk about McKinsey's contributions in the opioid crisis with Purdue Pharma. We could talk about the criminal charges for insider trading, which their former employees have been implicated in. We could talk about the consulting work that they did for ICE in the U.S. immigration. They're creating terrible conditions for refugees there. We could talk about McKinsey strategizing for Russian missile producers, Madam Speaker. We could talk about McKinsey's implication in China, where, of course, it is. Well, I thought it was public knowledge, but unfortunately, the Minister for Procurement and Public Services had never heard of this. That their retreat in China in 2018 took place only 7 kilometers from an internment camp, holding thousands of ethnic Uyghurs. And this was just a week after a United Nations committee had denounced the mass detentions and urged China to stop. McKinsey also consulted for China Communications Construction, which has built militarized islands in the South China Sea in violation of international law. And, of course, their ties with the Russian banks. In August of 2018, VEB Bank, which is owned by the Russian state, known to be intertwined with Russian intelligence under United States sanctions, hired McKinsey to develop its business strategy. So once again, a government, the Canadian government in particular, where we have such high ethical and moral standards across our country with our citizens, should not be doing business with a consulting firm with such low ethical standards. Madam Speaker, we need to call in the auditors. Madam Speaker, finally, they are not producing good value for money. It has been reported, Madam Speaker, that McKinsey has in fact increased their contracts by up to 193% over market value, 193%. In this government alone, Madam Speaker, we saw that 20 out of 23 contracts were not placed in competitive bid environments, that many of them were sole source, in fact, 20 out of 23, which once again makes us question the influence. We have seen the bad use of money, the example coming out of the Business Development Bank of Canada, where we saw lavish events, where we saw chauffeurs being flown to the other side of the country. We see public servants that are completely demoralized as a result of their not being consulted with these projects, and that all of the authority is being handed over to McKinsey. So, Madam Speaker, I think we need to just simply look at everything that the evidence shows that we should not trust this government, to audit themselves. We don't know how much they've spent, how they've made their major policy decisions, the lack of transparency and accountability. working with a company that has no strong ethical or values or moral standards, not producing good value for money. Madam Speaker, what do we need to do? We need to call in the auditors. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm not sure if the member is aware, but this side of the House will be voting in favour of this motion. We don't see a particular issue with it. But my question for her is, specifically, we do have guidelines and policies that are put in place for department heads and various different public servants to follow. We have processes to ensure that those have happened. Does she believe that the processes that are in place are being properly administered by our public service?
The honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Kingston and the Islands for that. It's apparent that they are not being followed, because even public servants are coming forward and expressing their discontent with the implication of McKinsey and Company to policy decisions, to outcomes, to policy direction, to execution of policies within the government. So they're clearly not being followed. And the fact that the government would propose that they themselves investigate these policies, which they have not themselves followed, is really quite ridiculous. And so that's, in fact, the reason that we're here today, Madam Speaker, is to have this motion to bring in an objective third party, the Auditor General, to do a thorough verification. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for her speech. And you know, Madam Speaker, I also want to thank her. We just came from the OGO committee, and the Conservatives demonstrated that they're willing to support the NDP and expanding, looking at all of the outsourcing, especially the $100 million plus procurement club, including, companies that benefited greatly under their government. In fact, under the Harper government, PricewaterhouseCoopers went from $9.8 million to $44 million a year in outsourcing, a 450% increase. So I guess my question through you, Madam Speaker, is when they initially looked at McKinsey, which is the small player of the $600 million plus procurement club that are getting outsourcing contracts that are literally running away from Canadians, why didn't they put forward a motion to look at Accenture, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and PricewaterhouseCoopers? I'd like to learn, Madam Speaker, why they neglected to look at those companies. And again, I do want to commend her for supporting the NDP's call to expand the scope and the probe of these companies. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for the question. As a relatively new member of the Government Operations Committee, I do know that we have an outsourcing study which is continuing, and I certainly look forward to continuing to evaluate many of the other outside companies which do consult to this government. But, I think we're here because it really was the Canadian public, and I even think our media within this country, that really turned Canadians and the official opposition onto what was going on here in this House and with this government relative to the unique relationship between McKinsey and Company with this government. So certainly, while I think those points are very important, our leader himself has said that he looks forward to empowering the public service once again by eliminating the use or reducing the use of consultants. I really think it was the Canadian people that drove us to really push on the McKinsey file, Madam Speaker.
For a brief question, l'honorable député de Rimouski-Nejet.
The honourable member for Rimouski-Nejet, Témiscouata-les-Basques. I'd like to tell my colleague I'm happy for her speech, and we are calling for full transparency by the federal government in the Bloc Québécois. There was a look into in the French Senate with the influence of these kind of consulting firms and their influence worldwide, and their recommendations discuss transparency, openness on the contracts, but also accountability, because at present they aren't accountable. These consultancies aren't accountable. And I'd like to know what my colleague thinks about that.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question. I think that's a valid point. It is something that we've seen with McKinsey. It's not just one department or two. There are several that are involved. The government has worked with McKinsey extensively, and I'm open to looking into the situation in all departments that are dealing with McKinsey. Thank you, Madam Speaker.